So, hi everyone. I will give you some insight on carbon farming and the French experience. First of all, what is the framework we have in France at the moment, and what method do we use? So Christian Holst-Leitner talked about the French label Bas Carbone. So it's the label created by the French Ministry for Ecological Transition in 2018. And how does it work? So this the ministry issued the creation of the label Bas Carbone in a decree. Then it enables experts and stakeholders to propose sectorial methods that are approved by the ministry. And then local projects can start with certification by the ministry. At the end of the project, an independent auditor will verify the emissions reductions. They are then recognized by the ministry, and we can have a funding by citizens, communities, and companies. In the live carbon farming project, we try to develop and to implement this model of the label Bas Carbone in other European countries involving Ireland, but also Germany, Belgium, Spain, and Italy. And the objective is to set rewarding common result-based rewarding mechanisms for 700 farms in these 6 European countries. So we have several technical actions, including elaborating this framework, implementing low-carbon projects on mixed crop livestock farms, and in the meantime, elaborating low-carbon project referential costs, and also apply the result-based carbon funding mechanism, that is to say, to make the link between the farmers and companies willing to fund them. So the low-carbon method we used in the French label Bas Carbone and in the live carbon farming project for livestock farms is the following one. So it's the carbon agri method. We have an eligibility criteria of maintaining or increasing carbon storage. It's for farm with dairy cattle, beef, or tillage production units. It covers indirect and direct emission reductions and also carbon sequestration. 40 practices are proposed to the farmers, and there is a mandatory evolution of environmental co-benefits. The units considered in this method are the emissions per kilogram of live meat or per liter of milk or hectare of crop. So here you have the different steps we have during the lifetime of a project. So it's projects of 5 years with an initial carbon assessment, with carbon tools, so Cap2Air, for example, in France. This carbon audit enables to build a carbon action plan with the farmers and the advisor. Then there are several follow-up visits to make sure that the carbon action plan is well implemented, and maybe there can be adjustments during the project. And at the end, there is a final audit, and then we can measure the real emissions reductions that have been carried out by the farmer. Then there will be a verification by an independent auditor and the recognition of carbon credits. So how do we involve farmers in low-carbon strategies? So here we'll present you 3 examples of French farms. To give you an idea of how much carbon farmers can avoid and how much money they can get from these tons of CO2 equivalent avoided. So here we have a case study of a beef farm, so 95 suckler cows, 185 hectares. And you have some technical information. The mitigation action plan of the farmer is to increase the surface of catch crops, reduce the use of chemical fertilizers, improve the health conditions of the animals, and produce renewable electricity. So each time the carbon action plan are really specific for each farm. And here you have results coming from the Cap2R tool. So you have on the top the initial assessment, so 14.1 kilogram of CO2 equivalent per live meat. It's the initial situation. And under you have the simulation, because the project of this farmer is not finished for now. So we did a simulation with the Cap2R tool. And the farmer should reach a carbon footprint of 12.1 kilograms per kilogram CO2 equivalent per kilogram of live meat. So it represents 608 tons of CO2 equivalent avoided during the 5 years of the project, including 30 tons of carbon storage and 578 tons of emissions reductions. And here we consider the price that is actually the price we have in France, so proposed by a company that is a national aggregator for agricultural projects in France, and I will talk about it just after. But with this price, the farmer can get around 20,000 euros for the 5 years of the project, and it represents 105 euros per hectare. Now, a case study of a dairy farm. So here, 69 dairy cows, 203 hectares, including a lot of tillage surfaces. And the mitigation action plan is on implementing direct seeding, seeding of legumes, increasing grazing length, improvement of the equipment to spread slurry, and biogas plant. And here we have the initial situation, 0.86 kilogram of CO2 equivalent per liter of milk. With this action plan, the farmer should reach the final situation of 0.78 kilogram of CO2 equivalent per liter of milk, so we'll see if it's the case. And it should enable to avoid 435 tons of CO2 equivalent, including 136 tons of carbon storage, and around 300 tons of emissions reductions. So here it represents an income of around 14,000 euros for the 5 years of the project, so 69 euros per hectare. And finally, a case study of a tillage farm, because it's quite different from the livestock farm, sorry. So here we have 149 hectares, including wheat, maize, protein crops, and grasslands. And the mitigation action plan is the following one. So better adjust forecast doses, taking into account climatic conditions to start inputs, intraplot modulation for nitrogen inputs, liming of acidic soils, landfill of organic and mineral inputs, introducing legumes in the rotation, increasing quantity of biomass coming from plant cover, and finally, increasing share of waste product for fertilization. So here we have, again, the initial situation and the simulation. So you have the emissions for each type of emissions and sequestration, so fertilization emissions, fossil energy emissions, and carbon sequestration. And what you can see is that the carbon gain is of 641 tons of CO2 equivalent, including this time much more carbon storage than emission reduction, so 566 tons of carbon storage and 75 tons of emission reductions. And here it represents an income of 20,500 euros received by the farmer during the 5 years of the project, so 138 euros per hectare. Here we have an implementation of these figures to the Irish context. So considering average GHG emissions per farm for suckler beef and dairy farms. And I won't detail all the figures, but just when we want to apply the national target you have in Ireland of minus 25% of emissions avoided. So it could represent 53 tons of CO2 equivalent avoided per farm for a suckler beef farm. And when we apply the price of carbon credits we have at the moment in France, it can represent an income of around €1,700 per farm for the 5 year of a carbon project. And for a dairy farm, it will be €3,400, considering that we have more GHG emissions for this type of farm. So here, 428 tons of CO2 equivalent per farm. So now, how to pay farmers? So here you have a representation of the organization we have at the moment in France. So I talked about FCAA, so France Carbone Agri. It's a company created by Farmers Association, and it makes the link between the farmer and their advisors, and we call them project developers, the independent auditor, the buyers, so companies can be agri-food companies or banks, restaurant chains, etc. And it also makes the link with the Ministry of Ecological Transition. They are contracting procedure for all these stakeholders, and the carbon credit price that has been decided by this Farmers Association running FCAA is €40 per tons of CO2 equivalent, including €32 for the farmer, €5 for the project developer, that is to say the advisors, and €3 for FCAA. Knowing that on average, with the previous projects we have in France, we had 600 tons of CO2 equivalent avoided per farm, so potential income of €20,000. So several ways for companies to fund farmers. So there are different strategies. It can be offsetting of the residual emissions of a company, voluntary contribution to the climate change mitigation, so without claiming offsetting, and reduction on scope 3. And I'll take the example of Lidl, for example. So Lidl France decided to reduce its emissions on scope 3 by purchasing label Bas Carbone certificates generated by its own beef suppliers. And also we have a low evolution regarding voluntary carbon market at the moment in France, because we have a mix of the voluntary and the mandatory carbon markets, because France decided to make mandatory offsetting of GHG emissions for coal-fired power plants, and the government said that this offsetting must be made in France with French projects. And we also have a European law with an obligation of publishing a CSR report every year for biggest companies. So to conclude, certification frameworks like Label Bas Carbone can be one of the solutions to fund the transition towards low carbon production systems. It's an incentive for farmers. So at the moment we have 1,250 agricultural projects of beef and dairy farms proposed by FCAA that have been certified by the ministry, representing 660,000 tons of CO2 equivalent avoided. So on average, again, it can represent an income of €20,000 per farm. But within this dynamic voluntary carbon market, rules must be clarified for companies wishing to fund low carbon projects. So again, there are several possible strategies, and not only carbon credits, but also more generally carbon certificates. And finally, as you can see, most of certified tons of CO2 equivalent avoided by livestock farms are emissions reductions and not carbon sequestration. So it's also important to fund farmers for these emissions reductions.